My mother and I were arguing about my decision to move across the country for a job, and in the middle of that argument, she said something so specific, so exactly worded, that I stopped mid-sentence. "You've always been like this," she said. "Even at 14, you wrote that you felt like nobody in this family actually saw who you really were." I had written that sentence, almost word for word, in a locked diary I kept hidden in my childhood bedroom, an entry I hadn't looked at in over a decade and had certainly never shared with anyone, let alone my mother. My name is Sophie, and this is the story of the specific, disorienting month I spent discovering that my mother had been reading my private journals for 15 years, from the time I was 14 until well into my adult life, and had used what she learned, again and again, across countless major decisions throughout my entire adolescence and young adulthood, to subtly steer, discourage, or manipulate choices she'd apparently decided weren't right for me. I want to explain what my relationship with my mother, Diane, looked like before this discovery, because I think understanding the specific texture of that relationship matters to understanding just how devastating this eventual revelation actually became. My mother had always been, throughout my entire life, what I would have described, right up until this discovery, as intensely involved, attentive, deeply engaged with every aspect of my life. The kind of mother other people sometimes described as close with her children in a way that occasionally struck outside observers as unusually thorough, though I'd always understood this simply as genuine maternal devotion rather than anything more concerning. I remember, specifically, how my mother always seemed to know things about my life that I hadn't directly told her, a pattern I'd always attributed, throughout my entire adolescence, to her general attentiveness and the small-town nature of the community we lived in, where information often traveled quickly through parents' informal networks. I remember friends occasionally commenting on how well my mother seemed to understand my emotional state, how she'd sometimes check in about specific worries I hadn't consciously realized I'd been carrying, moments that felt, at the time, like evidence of an unusually perceptive, caring mother rather than anything I would have recognized as concerning. I began keeping a diary around age 12, a habit that intensified considerably by 14, when I started using it as a genuine, private space to process the ordinary emotional complexity of adolescence, friendships, early romantic feelings, the increasingly complicated relationship I was developing with my own identity and independence as I moved through my teenage years. I kept this diary in what I believed, throughout my entire adolescence, was a genuinely secure hiding place, a small lockbox tucked inside my closet, secured with a combination lock I'd chosen specifically because I believed it represented a level of privacy my mother would respect. I want to describe the specific argument that ultimately revealed this 15-year invasion, because the actual moment of discovery arrived almost accidentally, through my mother's own unguarded, emotional response during a genuinely significant disagreement about my adult life choices, rather than through any deliberate investigation on my part. I had recently accepted a new job offer requiring relocation roughly 2,000 miles away from my childhood home, a decision that represented a genuinely exciting professional opportunity, but one my mother had responded to with unusually intense, persistent resistance throughout the weeks following my announcement. I want to describe this specific pattern of resistance, because in hindsight, it fits into a considerably larger pattern I wouldn't fully understand until this diary revelation forced me to reconsider countless similar moments throughout my entire life. During one particularly heated conversation about this relocation decision, my mother, clearly frustrated and increasingly emotional, said the specific sentence that would eventually unravel this entire 15-year secret. "You've always been like this," she said. "Even at 14, you wrote that you felt like nobody in this family actually saw who you really were." I want to try to describe the specific, vertiginous shock of hearing this sentence, understanding, in real time, that my mother had just quoted, nearly verbatim, a sentence from a private diary entry I'd written at 14 years old, an entry I hadn't personally looked at in well over a decade, one I had absolutely never shared with anyone, let alone discussed directly with my mother. "How do you know what I wrote in my diary when I was 14? I asked, my voice carrying a confusion that hadn't yet fully crystallized into the anger it would soon become. I want to describe watching my mother's face during this question, watching her realize, in real time, exactly what she'd just revealed through her own unguarded emotional response, watching the specific, telling panic that crossed her expression before she attempted, unsuccessfully, to deflect the question entirely. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice carrying an unconvincing, defensive quality that immediately told me something significant was actually being concealed. "I probably just remember you saying something similar at some point." I want to describe the following days, an increasingly urgent, disorienting process of trying to understand whether this specific comment represented some kind of coincidental phrasing, or whether it actually indicated something considerably more concerning about my mother's historical access to my private writing throughout my adolescence. I want to describe the specific, difficult conversation I eventually forced, roughly a week after this initial exchange, sitting my mother down directly and telling her I needed a completely honest answer regarding how she knew the specific content of a diary entry I'd never shared with her or anyone else. My mother's eventual confession, delivered after considerable initial resistance and deflection, revealed a truth considerably more extensive and more disturbing than even my growing suspicions had prepared me for. She admitted that she had, in fact, discovered the combination to my childhood diary's lockbox sometime during my early teenage years, and had continued reading my private journals, consistently and repeatedly, throughout my entire adolescence and well into my adult life, up until roughly 2 years before this specific confrontation, when I'd finally stopped keeping a physical diary altogether in favor of a private digital journal she apparently never managed to access. I want to try to describe the specific, sickening scope of this revelation, understanding that my mother had access to and had actually read, over a period spanning nearly 15 years, my most private thoughts regarding friendships, romantic relationships, my complicated feelings about my own family, my developing sense of identity and independence, essentially every genuinely private, unguarded reflection I'd ever committed to those pages, all without my knowledge or consent. Why would you do this? I asked, my voice breaking as the full weight of this discovery continued crystallizing. Why would you invade my privacy like this, for 15 years, and never once tell me? My mother's explanation, delivered through what became an increasingly emotional, complicated confession, revealed a specific pattern of anxious, controlling behavior that had apparently existed throughout my entire life, one I'd never fully recognized as such given how normalized her intense involvement in my life had always felt to me. I was scared, she said. I was scared of not knowing what was actually happening in your life, of missing something important, of not being able to help you if you were struggling with something you weren't telling me directly. Reading your diary felt like the only way I could actually understand what was really going on with you, beyond whatever surface version you chose to share with me directly. I want to describe the specific, devastating additional layer this situation introduced once I began more carefully examining my own memories of significant life decisions throughout my adolescence and young adulthood. Understanding that my mother hadn't simply passively read my private thoughts, but had apparently, repeatedly used this information to actively, if often subtly, influence and manipulate various significant choices throughout my life. I want to describe several specific examples that emerged as I began systematically reconsidering my own history through this new, devastating understanding. At 16, I had written extensively in my diary about a boy I had genuine, serious romantic feelings for, someone my mother had never previously expressed any particular concern about. Shortly after I would have written these specific entries, my mother began, seemingly out of nowhere, expressing pointed, persistent concerns about this same boy's character and suitability, concerns that ultimately contributed significantly to my own decision to end what could have been a genuinely meaningful early relationship. I want to describe another example from my early 20s when I had written, in my diary, about seriously considering a graduate program in a city considerably farther from home than my mother had ever expressed comfort with. Shortly after these entries, my mother began an intense, sustained campaign of subtle discouragement regarding this specific program, citing concerns about cost, about the program's actual quality, about various practical obstacles that, in hindsight, appeared calibrated specifically to address whatever private doubts and concerns I had actually expressed only in my diary, doubts I'd never directly shared with her. I want to try to describe the specific, disorienting process of reconsidering my own life choices through this new understanding, recognizing pattern after pattern where decisions I had always believed were genuinely, independently my own had actually been subtly, consistently influenced by a mother who possessed private, detailed knowledge of my innermost thoughts and doubts, information she used, again and again, to guide me toward choices she'd apparently decided were preferable, without ever revealing the actual source of her uncannily specific concerns and interventions. I want to describe the specific, ongoing complexity of processing this particular betrayal, understanding that unlike some forms of deception involving deliberate lies about external facts, this violation touched something considerably more intimate and foundational, my own private thoughts, my genuine, unguarded sense of self throughout my entire adolescent and young adult development. Information I had always believed remained genuinely private, only to discover it had been systematically accessed and weaponized in however well-intentioned a manner my mother might characterize her motivations throughout nearly 15 years of my life. I want to describe the difficult, extended process of therapy I began shortly after this discovery, working specifically to process both the practical reality of this invasion and the deeper, more unsettling question of how much of my own understanding of my independent choices and personal growth throughout adolescence and young adulthood had actually been genuinely self-directed versus subtly, invisibly shaped by a mother operating with private, unauthorized access to my most vulnerable thoughts. My therapist, a thoughtful, experienced woman named Dr. Whitfield, who specialized in family systems and boundary violations, helped me understand something during one of our earliest sessions that I've returned to often since. This isn't simply about privacy in the abstract, she explained. Your diary was specifically the place where you were developing your own independent sense of self, working through genuine uncertainty and vulnerability without the immediate pressure of anyone else's reaction or influence. Having that space secretly monitored and then used to shape real-world decisions undermines something genuinely foundational about healthy psychological development and autonomy. I want to describe the specific, ongoing difficulty of my relationship with my mother in the aftermath of this discovery, a relationship that, unlike some of the more straightforward financial betrayals I've heard described in similar situations, involves a considerably more complicated, ongoing process given both the depth of psychological violation involved and my mother's own apparent, genuine belief that her actions, however invasive, emerged from authentic maternal love and concern rather than any kind of deliberately malicious intent. I want to describe the extended, difficult conversation my mother and I eventually had, roughly 2 months after this initial discovery, once I'd had sufficient time in therapy to approach the conversation with more clarity than the raw, immediate devastation of those first difficult weeks had allowed. I need you to understand something, I told her during this conversation. Whatever your intentions were, you spent 15 years accessing my most private thoughts and then using that information to manipulate decisions I believed were genuinely my own. That's not love, even if it felt like love to you. That's control, and I need you to actually understand the difference, not just apologize for the specific mechanism of how you did it. I want to describe my mother's response to this conversation, which, while not producing the immediate, complete transformation I might have hoped for, did represent, I believe, a genuine, if difficult, beginning of acknowledgement, particularly once she began her own individual therapy specifically addressing the underlying anxiety and control patterns that had apparently driven this behavior throughout my entire adolescence and young adulthood. I want to describe the specific, ongoing work of rebuilding some functional relationship with my mother in the time since this discovery, a process that has required establishing considerably more explicit boundaries than existed throughout most of our previous relationship, alongside my own continued individual therapy, specifically addressing the deeper question of how to trust my own independent judgment and decision-making capacity, given how much of my adolescent and young adult development had apparently occurred under this invisible, manipulative influence. I want to describe the specific, complicated grief I've carried since this discovery, understanding that beyond the practical betrayal itself, I've had to grieve a version of my own personal history I'd always believed represented genuine, independent growth and self-discovery. Now understanding that significant portions of that development occurred under conditions I never actually consented to or was even aware of. It's been just over 2 years since that devastating argument first revealed this 15-year secret. I did ultimately take the job requiring relocation, a decision I made deliberately, consciously, partly as an assertion of the kind of genuine independence I now understood had been subtly undermined throughout much of my earlier life, moving forward with considerably more awareness regarding the importance of protecting my own private thoughts and independent decision-making process going forward. I think, often, about the specific cruelty of learning this truth through my mother's own unguarded emotional slip, understanding that had she simply maintained better control during that particular argument, I might genuinely never have discovered this 15-year invasion at all, continuing to believe, indefinitely, that my life's significant decisions had been genuinely, entirely my own, rather than subtly, invisibly shaped by information I never consented to share. If you've ever discovered that someone close to you had been secretly accessing your private thoughts or communications, using that information to subtly influence or manipulate your significant life decisions, I want to hear how you navigated both the practical process of establishing new boundaries and the deeper, more unsettling question this kind of discovery raises about how much of your own independent development might have occurred under invisible, unauthorized influence. I used to believe that my private journal represented a genuinely secure space, free from any outside influence or observation, where I could authentically process my own developing sense of self without concern about how that vulnerable self-exploration might be used against me. I've learned, in the most disorienting way possible, that even our most carefully protected private spaces can become compromised by someone close enough and motivated enough by their own anxiety or need for control to violate that privacy consistently over many years, using what they learned to subtly, invisibly shape decisions we've always believed represented our own genuine, independent growth.